Hello, History 72B, spring quarter. Yes, it is spring quarter, 2023. Got it. I know I've told you this before, but I'll tell you again because it's true. I'm still reading your quiz answers and I'm still really happy with them. So keep up the good work. We have gotten to the Second World War in class, and we're starting package F, World War II and following, changing women work into women's work. Women's employment went up in World War II. Many women felt empowered by this, or at least relieved to have greater say in their lives when they had money of their own to spend, and even more, with men away, time of their own in which to spend it, even if goods were rationed. We will start by looking at the classic Rosie story, then look at what options really existed, and finally take a quick look at one specific example and the reality surrounding it. Most people get the Rosie the Riveter story in Women's History Month, if nowhere else. But where did the Rosie image come from? Rosie died in 2015, or more precisely, Mary Doyle Keefe passed away on 21 April 2015 at the age of 92. Mary Doyle was the model for Norman Rockwell's Rosie the Riveter painting, which appeared on the cover of the Memorial Day 29 May 1943 issue of the Saturday Evening Post. In the U.S., Rosie has come to stand for the women who were part of the labor force, particularly in industrial jobs during World War II. Often when people picture Rosie now, they think of the "we can do it" image. Ask most people on the street why Rosie the Riveter was important, and you are likely to get the same sort of responses that I did when I tried it. Women started working in World War II, so they became more confident. Women were always confident or not confident. The U.S. needed women to work because the men were at war, and women proved that they were as good as men. Women had been proving that for a very long time, not to mention non-binary people. Something about World War II and women and work. The real picture, just like the original Rosie cover, is more complicated and much more interesting. If you are with me in this class, by now you know that women have always worked. Women in the U.S. worked for wages before World War II. This should not be in doubt, but it still seems to come as a surprise sometimes. If you know someone who hasn't thought much about it, you might try sending them to read about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, or Black women's labor in the South after the Civil War, or the involvement of Latinas in labor disputes of the 1930s. The kind of work that any particular woman was able to get and the responses to her involvement in waged labor depended on larger social and political attitudes about race, class, age, marriage, and family. During the Depression, government and corporate policy actively discouraged married women in particular from wage labor, under the generally mistaken impressions that they would take jobs away from men and that their families could survive on a husband's wages alone. The remarkable thing about World War II was the complete about-face in policy that the government and media took toward women, especially married women in the workforce. There was a concerted effort to get women into, rather than out of, paid work in the now booming war economy. Not only did the number of women who were employed rise dramatically and the antipathy to married women working drop precipitously, but women who had already been employed often were able to move into higher paying jobs that had previously been reserved solely for men. And I will say that not all Rosies were young. In fact, many of those people who had been working for a while and moved into higher paying industry were older women. So, at any rate, there is some truth in the something about women work and empowerment impression that my interviewees had, but there was also a catch, a big catch. Government and popular media collaborated on an active propaganda campaign to get women to fill out the workforce, but they framed it as the temporary patriotic duty of women to do men's jobs while the men were off being soldiers. Although women were told that they could do it, they were also told to be ready when the war ended to give it up and go back home. This is the context in which Rosie the Riveter came into being. The now famous "We Can Do It" poster was produced probably around 1942 by J. Howard Miller, an artist at Westinghouse. She wasn't known as Rosie, and in fact, she wasn't widely seen at the time at all. The Saturday Evening Post, on the other hand, had a circulation of about 4 million in the 1940s, and they printed extra issues when Norman Rockwell was the cover artist. Rosie was a Rockwell. So why has the familiarity of these two images flipped in the decades since they were created? The Rockwell Post picture had copyright restrictions, which limited its publication after the war. The image by the little-known Pittsburgh artist Miller did not. The black and white photos of the young woman that you see here were the specific inspiration for the Weekend Do It poster. She was a real person. Rockwell's Rosie exudes strength. She doesn't need a slogan to tell us that she can do it. Her body and demeanor convey that clearly. As it happens, Rockwell modeled Rosie's physique and pose on Michelangelo's Isaiah from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He even positioned her work visor, which is redundant because she's already wearing goggles, to suggest a halo. You can see that the visor is around her head here, and she has the goggles on as well. Of course, he also put a ham sandwich in her hand. Rosie's dedication to work and country may be otherworldly, but Rosie herself couldn't be more down to earth. In fact, it is the solidity of her arms and neck that first strike most viewers and go a long way to conveying her power and effectiveness in a man's job. One of my son's high school history teachers insisted that Rockwell used Michelangelo's work as a model because, quote, no woman could be that large and strong. I would love to introduce him to some of my friends. While he was wrong on the merits, his opinion is relevant because it springs from the equation of masculinity with strength and capability and the associated fear that working white women would lose their femininity, a fear which wartime propaganda and advertising paradoxically both fought and reinforced. Rockwell himself sent his model, Mary Doyle, a letter 24 years after she posed for him, in which he apologized for bulking her up and assured her that she was one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen. The implication is clear. When needed for the sake of the country, a powerful woman's body could be beautiful, but under other circumstances, feminine beauty and physical size and strength were at odds. Rockwell put deliberate reassurances of Rosie's femininity into the painting. She has a powder compact and a handkerchief peeking out of her pocket, and I've enlarged that over here. It's almost perfectly, not quite, but almost perfectly at the center of the picture, and it's closely juxtaposed to the massive riveting gun. So yes, she has this, but she's still a girl, folks. Her hands and forearms look like they are smudged with grime. She wears a leather wrist guard, but her cheeks and lips are rosy. We have no way of knowing whether, as some writers suggest, she's meant to be wearing rouge and lipstick, but it would not be surprising if she were. Advertisers were quick to capitalize on the pressure for women to both work and conform to beauty standards. Rosie's clothing was carefully orchestrated as well. While her overalls might not seem remarkable now, at the time they were a significant indicator of her step into industry. Prior to the war, as you all know, white American women rarely wore trousers in public. In the first photo shoot, Rockwell preferred to work from photos rather than from life. Mary Doyle wore a white shirt and saddle shoes. Rockwell asked her to come back for another shoot the next day because he wanted to substitute a blue shirt and penny loafers. Those shoes, the penny loafer resting decisively and disdainfully on Hitler's Mein Kampf, are also surprisingly informative. Women generally wore their own shoes to work, and prior to July of 1943, many women could not get the kind of metal-toed safety shoes worn in heavy industry in their sizes. Manufacturers had seen no reason to make them. The symbolism of the American flag that forms the background is unmistakable, but Rosie is wearing other signs of patriotism as well. Among them, pins for victory, blood donation, and her security badge. Finally, there's her lunchbox down here that her hand is resting on, behind the handle of the riveting gun. Why did Rockwell choose the name Rosie to put on the tin box? Red Evans and John Jacob Lebb wrote a song called Rosie the Riveter in 1942 and released it in early 1943, a few months before Rockwell made the painting for the Saturday Evening Post. It played on radios across the nation and was performed live by a number of bands. A version by the African-American group The Four Vagabonds was especially popular, and you have a link to it in your pop culture bundle for this package. I have also put some of the lyrics here. Rosie's got a boyfriend, Charlie. Charlie, he's a Marine. Rosie is protecting Charlie, working overtime on the riveting machine. When they gave her a production E, she was as proud as a girl could be. There's something true about, red, white, and blue about Rosie the Riveter. Naming the riveter he created from the 19-year-old telephone operator who modeled for him, Rosie, would have struck the final patriotic note. Women worked, and while government and industry relied on their labor, propaganda and advertising tended to present women in terms of how they could serve men, with nations secondary and women themselves as a distant third. As historian Megan Winchell has noted, the world wars drew American women from diverse class and racial backgrounds to new forms of paid labor, provided them with different platforms from which to make citizenship claims, and resurrected old ideas of self-sacrificial motherhood while launching new images of empowered femininity, no matter how much those might seem to be at odds. So, for example, canning or work in the needle trades now supplied the armed forces with fighting food and uniforms, but still had the sense of feeding and clothing male members of a family. Of course, munitions factories paid better, partly because you could die if anything went wrong. But what mother wouldn't sacrifice her life for her son? The male-led advertising approach stressed women as nurturers and hotties rather than people doing work. The quintessential image of the girl waiting for her soldier was either the girl back home or the rather obvious and ubiquitous pinup girls, especially the ones painted on planes. These were not ordinary women with welding burns from work. Even if propaganda posters did not feature them, women of color did not sit idly by. Black women left domestic work for more highly paid work in factories and shipyards like Oakland. Mexican-American women left canneries and textile mills for the aircraft industry like Lockheed Martin in Los Angeles. Having seen racism undamped by service in the Civil War and World War I, the generation of Black workers and soldiers, men and women alike, promoted a double V campaign: victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home, victory for democracy in both places. Despite this, many employers tried to keep their segregated factories. One Black woman stated in an interview that employers, quote, did everything they could to keep you separated. They just did not like for a Negro and a white person to get together and talk. Despite resistance, women did serve in the military. Women, white and Black, served as nurses, doctors, and surgeons. The ANC, or Army Nurse Corps, had denied Black women entry in the First World War, but changed their policy for the Second. The creation of the Women's Army Corps, or WAC, W-A-C, in 1943 created women soldiers. But soldier meant different duties for women than for men. When it came to the Army, women ended up in what amounted to domestic labor, cooking and cleaning or clerical work already coded as female or pink collar and unskilled. Basically, they were caretakers to the troops, not actual troops themselves. One congressman worried about women in the Army, saying, "Who then will maintain the home fires? Who will do the cooking, the washing, the mending, the humble, homey tasks to which every woman has devoted herself?" Now, I hope you see that every woman is a lie right there, but a number of points here. This is why you may not use the word traditional. The world of women happily in the home is a myth this man was perpetuating. We know that women worked outside the home, and we know that what really worries him is that so many women do not want to be stuck doing the humble, homey tasks that he himself did not want to do. This is, as so often, about power and fear. He might have to do his own dishes, and he was terrified of the idea. Male soldiers in the Army dominated skilled tasks like mechanics in the US, leaving women to do the caretaking. And I specify in the US because the situation was different in Europe. WACs, or WACs, were not classified as combatants. Women were not combatants. They were not allowed to carry weapons for fear that doing so would undermine men and disrupt the protector-protected relationship. Heaven forbid that a woman protect herself. The Women's Army Corps did admit Black women, like the Nursing Corps, but in both cases into segregated units. The Air Force, on the other hand, did not admit Black women into the Women Air Force Service Pilots Division, but they did allow white women to fly planes. These women did just fine, despite the resentment of male pilots and fears of doctors that menstruating women would be incapacitated by their periods. As in the Army, women in the Air Force did not count as combatants, even the 38 who died in their planes in the line of duty. Female Air Force pilots who died in the line of duty were not given military funerals. They were not even honored as war dead. Women pilots who lived did not receive veteran status or benefits. This will matter to us when we talk about the GI Bill in a later lecture. To go back to the Women's Army Corps, Black women were forced to serve in segregated units, but Japanese women served in the same units with white women. This is moderately surprising, as the US was so worried about Japanese spies that the country put all Japanese Americans on the West Coast into prison camps, regardless of age or sex. You have a primary source reading about that in this package. Young Japanese women could leave the camps by joining the Army. Some trained as Japanese linguists at the Military Intelligence Service Language School and then served as translators for the U.S. Army. Well more than 5,500 Black American women served in World War II, despite a country that kept them in segregated units. Our on-the-ground story in this lecture is about the 6888, the only Black women's Army Corps unit to serve in Europe during World War II. There is much more to an army than fighting. Armies need supply lines and they need morale. The 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion worked on both. The battalion served in England and France. A backlog of letters and care packages had been collecting in Europe literally for years while these men were fighting. This may sound trivial, but it meant that men fighting had no idea if their families were okay, if they had lost parents or loved ones at home, and they had no moral support from back in the States. Mary McLeod Bethune, whom you see over on the right here, appeared very, very briefly at the end of a previous lecture. She combined forces with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to send the 6888 to join white women's battalions already in Europe. The image that you have shows Mary McLeod Bethune with two of the battalion members. The 6888 was sent to England in February of 1945. They were under the command of Major Charity Adams, shown here inspecting the group. Apparently, a general told Adams that he was, quote, going to send a white first lieutenant down here to show you how to run this unit. Major Adams replied, over my dead body, sir, and no white lieutenant was sent. When the 6888 arrived, they were shocked by what they found. Because of a shortage of personnel and reluctance to include segregated units, mail had been filling warehouses and airplane hangars for years. The women had to work 3 shifts a day using information cards and serial numbers, no computers, right, to match mail with millions of troops and personnel. They managed 65,000 pieces of mail per shift. So that would be around 6 million pieces of mail per month. Addresses used nicknames and might be addressed to places that the personnel had already left. Men on the front were moved around constantly. Many soldiers had the same name. For example, there were 7,500 Robert Smiths. Nonetheless, the 6888 pulled off their duty in half the time that had been allotted to them and were sent on to France. Despite completing a nearly impossible assignment more quickly than expected, members of the 6888 were just sent home with no recognition. although many of them did go on with their educations and careers under their own volition. Charity Adams of the "Over My Dead Body" comment became the first Black American woman promoted to lieutenant colonel. Observers from the military lauded the unit for opening hearts and minds to what Black women could accomplish. Opinions from inside the battalion were less rosy, as Black women believed that their service and that of other Black Americans should have translated into a broader impact on society. As one woman noted, "The thing is, you think that all of that is going to make things better for racial equality and so forth, but it has no effect, really. It's painful to see what we still haven't really brought it together." Key points for Lecture 18 in Module F, or Package F. During World War II, the U.S. government and corporations encouraged women to take industrial jobs to maintain wartime production, giving rise to the Rosie the Riveter story. Although women, both married and unmarried, worked, propaganda from both the government and corporations stressed that this was meant to be temporary and that women belonged in the home, not competing with men for jobs. Advertising also encouraged women to worry about their appearance, even as they worked, marketing products like makeup as essentials. Women were pictured as young, either the wholesome girlfriend waiting at home or the pinup girl constantly ready for a man. Many factories also tried to keep Black and white workers separated from one another. The armed forces were also segregated up to Truman for both women and men. Unlike in World War I, however, the Army Nurse Corps, ANC, did accept Black women in World War II. The Women's Army Corps, or WAC, W-A-C, did allow Black women, although in segregated units. All WACs were given caretaker jobs like cooking and cleaning, not the more skilled jobs like mechanic given to men. And I put skilled in quotes because if you cook, you know that it takes skill to cook. It takes skill to clean. Politicians actively worried that women in the military would not want to go back, and again, putting it in quotes because they never were only there, to serving husbands in the home after war. Women were not even allowed to carry guns, as this might upset the protector-protected social dynamic. The Air Force did not allow Black women to join the Women Air Force Service Pilots Division. White women were allowed to fly planes, but their work did not count as combat, even if they were killed in the line of duty. The 38 women killed were not given military funerals. Women pilots who survived were not given any veterans' benefits. The WAC 6888 Battalion demonstrated both the absolute necessity of war work beyond fighting and the competence of a Black unit to get that work done. The major who commanded the 6888 became the first Black woman promoted to lieutenant colonel, but otherwise the unit was largely ignored when they finished their tour of duty. It was expected that women, including Black women, would serve to boost the morale of troops, but there was no attention to nor support for the morale of women in the military. I talked briefly about women in the Air Force and Army, but I did not mention the WAVES, W-A-V-E-S, the Navy analog. The acronym stood for Women Accepted for Volunteer Service. One suspects that they came up with the word WAVES first and then chose words to fit the letters. At any rate, the story of the WAVES uniforms is a good encapsulation of the effort made to remind women that they were most assuredly not men, and that they should remember to be attractive to men. I'm going to preface this by saying that I actually really like the WAVES uniforms. I can both admire them aesthetically and still see the behind-the-scenes gendering work that they did. Your mileage may vary. At any rate, their uniforms were news at the time. So this is from a newsreel that came before a film, and the newsreel is about WAVES get uniforms. The Navy maintained tight control over its image during World War II. So the issue of what women would wear came up before there were actually women to wear the uniforms. WAVES director Mildred McAfee was initially not included with the uniform design. When presented with the initial design, she was horrified with what she saw, saying, "A red, white, and blue stripe? It just looked like a chorus girl, you know?" And I was simply struck, and I said, "We cannot do it. These are actually chorus girls and not the Navy uniform." And you might think about the insult to chorus girls encapsulated there. The sentiment expressed on the slide by mid-20th century designer Elizabeth Hawes fits with our skirts article. It is not very difficult for a designer to understand the motives of wearing clothes for physical protection. The hard thing is to grasp how important it is to many people to get psychological protection from their clothes. Wearing trousers was not going to be an option for parade uniforms for women in World War II, but a decently designed uniform could be the difference between looking professional and being taken seriously, or looking like a woman in the performing arts associated with sexuality. And again, we could chew on that right there, but we won't for now. So the Navy hired an haute couture designer to create the Waves uniforms. Monboucher, already famous at the time, was an American designer with an atelier in Paris. One of his clients was Josephine Forrestal, a writer for American Vogue and wife of the Secretary of the Navy. Former Waves tend to remember their uniform fondly. I've gotten to see the uniforms, not the Waves, in person, and they are indeed refined with touches for fitting that Army uniforms for women did not have. And you can look back at some of the images in the main lecture to see what I mean by that. In fact, the Navy learned from early mistakes by the Army. When the WAC uniform was announced, newspaper writers focused as much on the Army-issued girdles as the uniform the recruits would wear. By contrast, the Waves did not discuss undergarments and attempted to present a very dignified image. I'm sure the Army had meant to as well. They just failed. In a September 1942 radio interview, Waves public relations officer Louise Wilde mentioned the, quote, deep respect and pride Navy women would feel about their uniform. But she also cautioned, again, quote, "If I may make bold to speak for all of my fellow officers, it is the work to be done and not the material errors that count with them." In other words, she had to remind the audience that there were people in the uniform who worked, and that the work was far more important than a designer uniform. The Navy used the uniform as a recruitment tool, pointing out the specifics of the design as well as its couture pedigree. One photo booklet called A Letter from Naval Reserve Midshipmen's School, WR, Northampton, Massachusetts, was designed to be mailed by a Wave officer candidate to family and friends. While pictures of the Waves in action, and by extension their uniform, are scattered throughout, 5 of the 32 pages in the booklet are devoted just to describing what the women wore. Monboucher's name is mentioned twice. The uniform, quote, "of which we are so proud," is described as soft but trim with extremely glamorous lines. And apparently the recruitment strategy worked. The uniforms gathered attention. One recruiter described one of her job duties as walking around downtown areas in her uniform and simply talking to people who asked about it. And I have a quote here on the slide from one Navy Wave. It says, "A darling girl came out in her Wave uniform, a little blonde, cute as she could be. She was a recruiter. I think I made up my mind that minute that had us the way to go." Women outside the military initially attempted to copy the Wave uniform design, but found that they could be fined $300 and be sentenced to 6 months in jail if they were caught. In 1943, the Waves, along with other women in uniform, were named as Vogue's best dressed women in the world today. In this coda, I leave it to you to tease out what you might consider progress in that story and what you might not, and how complicated that can be.